The body of a 63-year-old man was found in a rented room in Portsmouth on the 9th of May 2019. It was concluded that Steve Dymond had taken his own life 2 days before he was eventually discovered by the landlady of the property. But question marks arose over what exactly had driven this deeply troubled individual to take such drastic measures, and perhaps it wasn't just a complete coincidence that a mere 5 days before Steve Dymond took his own life, he'd appeared as a guest on an episode of The Jeremy Kyle Show, in which the controversial, snarling TV host had aggressively accused Steve of failing a lie detector test and cheating on his beloved fiancée. Allegations which a clearly dumbfounded Steve had found difficult to even comprehend. The episode in question was never broadcast, and the tragedy led to the swift cancellation of a frankly bizarre early morning TV show that had been entertaining the masses for over 14 years, with a noisy circus of fiery showdowns, slanging matches, sneering accusations, dodgy resolutions, and tempers boiling over to the point where the participants had to be physically separated to avoid brawls erupting on the studio floor. The death of Steve Dymond didn't just bring down the curtain on Jeremy Kyle's mainstream career, but it also signalled the end of a whole genre of cruel reality television which had been allowed to fester on our screens for far too long. Although a long-delayed inquest attempted to shed light on the factors that contributed to Dymond's death, the jury's still out on who should really carry the can. Perhaps it was inevitable that this grief-stricken individual undergoing a personal crisis would have taken the same route without getting pushed into a corner by a dubious TV show. But would Jeremy Kyle follow his own manifesto by manning up and taking full responsibility for any part that he potentially played? Or did the problems lie much deeper within the production of a show that exploited some of the most vulnerable and desperate people in our society? An even more sobering thought for those seeking to point the finger of blame is that maybe the great British public should be looking just a little closer to home. Unlike the Jeremy Kyle Show, this video is most definitely not brought to you today by Foxy Bingo. Eyes down. A quick hop around the UK's morning TV schedules of today might lead you into a new episode of Homes Under the Hammer, or perhaps another chance to watch an old episode of Garden Rescue, The Repair Shop, or Escape to the Country. It all feels so reassuringly wholesome, and there's never so much as a slightly raised voice to puncture the cheery atmosphere. But the TV morning landscape felt strikingly different not so very long ago. As recently as 2019, around 1 million members of the British TV audience felt that the best way to kickstart the day ahead was to enjoy a cup of coffee and a bowl of soggy Weetabix whilst tuning into 60 minutes of poor people screaming into each other's faces, accusing each other of deceitful behaviour and storming off stage. They were often chased by a judgmental and opinionated host who was apparently attempting to offer conflict resolution whilst clutching his test results and tearing strips off of anyone who dared to disagree with him. Ladies and gentlemen, this was The Jeremy Kyle Show. Some might suggest that the concept was already hopelessly out of date by the time the show first launched on ITV in 2005, but it's an arguable point. Yes, Jerry Springer had been doing this kind of trash TV over in the US since 1991, although Springer was clearly a calming influence in an outrageous carnival now widely accepted to be largely scripted and choreographed. Jeremy Kyle's more direct predecessor was the show that he replaced in the ITV morning after Trisha Goddard defected to Channel 5. Trisha's had been running since 1998 and had gradually evolved into a show that provided conflict resolution to working class guests with the help of DNA tests and lie detectors. Trisha herself was the empathetic host who listened to her guests and helped to diffuse any tensions when it looked as though things might start kicking off. In many ways, though, the approach of the Jeremy Kyle Show was quite different. Whilst the format borrowed the DNA tests and lie detectors from Trisha and mashed this up with the rowdy atmosphere of the Jerry Springer Show, the result was a new breed of morning TV which dealt with genuine everyday guests and situations in a ruthless, new, no-nonsense style. Rather than making any attempt to quell the storm during a potentially prickly scenario, Jeremy Kyle, otherwise known by the nickname Jezza, would ramp up the tension to 11 and seemingly goad his guests into a full-on tantrum. The formula became crushingly familiar. Of the 20,000 guests that were invited onto the show, the vast majority were poor, white, and not always particularly articulate working class people who had some kind of family or relationship problem that only a highly skilled moral maestro like Jeremy Kyle could help put to bed once and for all. Many of the cases involved disputes over the biological father of a child, which were resolved by taking paternity tests funded by the show. The results of which were then revealed to the family for the first time in front of an enthralled studio audience. Other cases revolved around suspected infidelity, drug addictions, family breakups, and tried to figure out which one of the suspects on stage was really responsible for stealing the £10 note from a toddler's piggy bank. Results from the infamous lie detector tests were often wheeled out to comprehensively resolve some of these matters and reveal who was telling the truth and who was telling porkies. Well, the term lie detector was always used within the show, but we are of course talking about a polygraph test, which the British Polygraph Association claims is the most reliable technique to test if someone is being deceptive to a specific issue. However, just to make things absolutely clear, a caption always sprang up on screen just before results were announced, informing viewers that the test results may not be 100% accurate. If any of the guests ever angrily contested the results, Carl would occasionally state that the lie detectors were around 96% accurate. This heavily implied that the guilty party was now just venting their frustration about getting exposed as a liar on television, as the chances of the detector dishing out wrong results were so small. Security guard Steve was a regular presence lurking in the background. The bouncer headed up a team of muscle men who were there to prevent Jeremy from getting his teeth kicked in whenever he wound up a guest to the point of potential violence. Another regular face was that of Graham Stanier, a psychotherapist and specialist mental health nurse who briefly popped up in the aftermath of a particularly traumatic or sensitive case to offer a few gentle words of wisdom and support. Graham was also involved in organising the aftercare of some of the troubled guests once the cameras had stopped rolling and their 15 minutes of fame were over. And it has to be said that many of the guests who appeared on the show later claimed that the show changed their lives for the better. Former drug addicts had revealed that they kicked the habit for good after the show shoved them in the direction of rehab. Sometimes we saw them getting literally shoved into a limousine waiting outside the studio. Other guests have given credit to the show for helping to reconcile damaged relationships or for steering them into a healthier lifestyle. Graham Stanier told The Observer as early as 2007, "We do follow-up shows, full shows of people coming back on the programme who have been successful in overcoming drug, alcohol or relationship problems through the care that we have provided. We have a very good record on this." Without wanting to undermine these success stories, we're sometimes left with the impression that all this aftercare was funded directly from the pockets of this incredibly charitable production. But what actually happened was that members of the aftercare team made a few quick phone calls to appropriate local services, which were either funded by the government or run on a voluntary basis, and then sent the guests their way, sometimes in a limousine. This is obviously something the guests could easily have done themselves without going down the long-winded route of appearing on television first, and perhaps the limousine wasn't strictly necessary. But the idea is that Jeremy Kyle was the only man on earth who could persuade them to go to rehab in his typical brash and forthright manner. However, professional counsellors have also noted that people suffering from addictions ideally need to be fully prepared and committed to the concept of rehabilitation before taking such a big leap, and that horridly shoving them into a limousine during the recording of a television show might not be the most effective first step to long-term recovery. But even so, there's no denying that the Jeremy Kyle show certainly helped a big chunk of the 20,000 people that appeared on the show. And Jezza himself wasn't always the heartless monster that he's frequently made out to be. It's true that most of his popular catchphrases tended to emerge from the moments in which he was insulting his guests, and he had a catchphrase for every occasion. Let's say that he thinks you're a bloke who's making too many children without the capacity of supporting them. Jeremy's withering response would be, "Why don't you put something on the end of it?" And if Jeremy thinks that a guest is talking too much and hogging his spotlight, it's called the Jeremy Kyle Show. Should Jeremy believe that a guest is not facing up to his responsibilities, well then it's, "Why don't you grow a pair?" And if Jezza feels that a guest needs to join the British workforce, "You're not on benefits, are you? Why don't you get off your lazy backside and get a job?" And even finally, if Jeremy has completely given up, "Get off my stage." But there were plenty of other times when Jeremy showed genuine kindness and consideration to his guests, and occasionally even seemed like the only voice of reason in a TV studio crammed full of idiots. For example, a guy called Jeff appeared on the show and revealed that he'd been a victim of domestic violence. When he explained how he'd once jumped off a balcony 3 stories high to escape his violent female partner and ended up badly injured in hospital, the response from some members of the audience was to start giggling. Carl was quick to turn on the audience and berate them for laughing, explaining at great length why the situation wasn't funny. Thankfully, our faith in human nature was partially restored when his monologue received an overwhelming round of applause from the audience. Another guest had a hard time following her original appearance on the show. Gemma Swift had participated in an episode in which she was pleading with her boyfriend's ex-partner to stop harassing her. But all the online chatter afterwards consisted of nasty remarks about her teeth. Gemma had walked into a lamppost as a kid, which left her with distinctive buck teeth, and this led to the merciless mocking of a guest who became more commonly known to the nation as Tooth Woman. Gemma returned to the show a little later on to reveal how badly she'd been affected by the relentless taunts, and the show's response was to fork out £10,000 so that Gemma could have her teeth fixed up. Maybe we really are talking about an incredibly charitable production here after all. And it's refreshing to hear a story about online trolling which ends with a sparkling smile. But it was the more sensationalist stories which really gripped the headlines. One of the most memorable episodes of all featured a segment with the intriguing title, "Have I Been Having Sex with My Brother?" Carl chatted to a couple of young guys called Paul and Lee who'd met on a dating site and had formed a serious relationship. But nagging doubts began to emerge when Paul was introduced to Lee's mum, who felt that Paul bore quite an uncanny resemblance to her ex-husband. Her concerns grew when she discovered that Paul and her ex-husband also shared the same surname. She told Lee for the first time that he had half-brothers from his mum's previous marriage who'd been put into care, and funnily enough, Paul had spent time in care when he was a very young child before he was adopted. You can see where this is heading. Paul and Lee then appeared on the Jeremy Kyle show to get a definitive answer from DNA tests taken on Paul and the ex-husband of Lee's mum. The DNA results are in, Jeremy opens the envelope, Paul and Lee are definitely half brothers. Cue several minutes of horrifying anguish. Other gripping segments on the show, which will never be forgotten, went by titles such as "I'll marry you if you prove you only cheated 18 times," or "Prove I'm the dad and I'll prove I haven't slept with my mum," or "My boyfriend thinks I cheated with another man through a letterbox," and the all-time classic, "My lesbian niece doesn't know if her gay ex-boyfriend is the father." Bearing in mind the blatant complexity of some of these mind-boggling cases, it's possibly a good job that the host was supremely qualified to handle such delicate situations. Or was he? In fact, who even is Jeremy Kyle? You might assume that the reason this man was so in tune with his working class guests is that he himself was born into poverty and was working down the mines from the age of 7. And if any of his guests dared to complain that they were currently living in a shoebox on the motorway, Kyle might well have dismissed this as a luxury. But in fact, young Jezza enjoyed quite a privileged upbringing. He was educated at a private school in Berkshire, and his dad was a personal secretary to the Queen Mother for over 40 years. After working at Marks & Spencer and an insurance company, he embarked upon a career in local radio in the 1990s before making the move to Virgin Radio and then London's Capital FM. It was during this time that he hosted a show called Confessions, in which he took calls from listeners and offered them advice on all manner of relationship issues. It could be said that the Confessions show was kind of a forerunner of what would eventually evolve into the Jeremy Kyle show on ITV, and it certainly helped Jeremy get that gig. Shortly after it was announced that Trisha was moving to Channel 5, the ITV director of Daytime and Lifestyle, Diane Nelms, just happened to catch an episode of Confessions on the radio and invited Jeremy Kyle to audition for Trisha's replacement show. The Jeremy Kyle show was born, and he's certainly had a few personal problems over the years. His first marriage broke up in 1991 because Jeremy became addicted to gambling, racking up debts of over £12,000. He later revealed in his 2009 book, I'm Only Being Honest, that, quote, "I will never understand what a hit of heroin feels like, but gambling, I get. Big time. There was this pull and suddenly I was chasing money, trying to achieve something that has never been achieved. Making a bookie. Poor." He also revealed in the same year that he suffers from obsessive-compulsive disorder and often licks his own mobile phone to make sure it's clean. He apparently used to lick golf clubs as well, until we heard that some guy in America had once died from pesticide poisoning after doing the exact same thing. But whilst he may know a thing or two about gambling addiction and licking golf clubs, this privately educated man, whose dad worked for the Queen Mum, still might not seem like the ideal candidate to cast instant judgment on the lives of people living in a council estate in Rotherham who are struggling to survive on benefits and living on pot noodles. And his whole television persona regularly came under fire from critics. It was noted that Carl often appeared to be just as angry or even angrier than the guests he was supposedly trying to calm down. And if things weren't getting quite spicy enough, he often ended up screaming into the faces of his guests in what could be interpreted as a deliberate attempt to wind them up and provoke an unpleasant reaction. During one almost comical episode, he fiercely yelled at one of his guests, "Do something about your anger issues." He frequently appeared to be looking down his nose at people in more unfortunate circumstances than himself, dismissing them as a waste of space if they were finding it difficult to secure a job. One woman who was struggling in her battle with heroin addiction was quickly and aggressively dismissed by Carl as disgusting, a disgrace to society, and nothing more than a burden on her family. And in fact, the whole concept of the show was slammed throughout its long run, with many critics describing it as a modern-day freak show or exploitative poverty porn. Former head of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, Simon Wesley, described the show as a theatre of cruelty, and yes, it might entertain 1 million people a day, but then again, so did Christians versus lions. Just in case you're not sure, he's referring to the days of the ancient Roman Empire, when Christians were thrown to lions, rather than a long-forgotten ITV daytime show called Christians vs. Lions. One of the biggest and most eloquent critics of all, though, was the celebrated writer and producer Charlie Brooker, who made various venomous comments about the show over the years. He described Jeremy Kyle as a psychotic head of a man who, presumably, doesn't wake up in a morning. He slithers into our world through a haunted mirror. Brooker also described the show as completely and utterly horrid. It's a non-stop bellowing festival in which a cast of people who resemble a sort of aquatic livestock chart the outer limits of incomprehension. But there were yet even more deeply concerning elements to the fundamental concept of the show, and one of the most significant was that of the lie detector test. See, there was no problem at all with the paternity stuff, as the DNA tests used on the show were over 99% accurate. So, sorry, Paul and Lee, but it looks like you really are half-brothers. But it was a very different story with lie detectors. The first minor niggle is that there's not really any such thing as a lie detector. A polygraph test actually works by measuring stress, and does that by observing fluctuations in physiological indicators such as your blood pressure and heart rate. It doesn't quite have the capacity to poke into your mind and figure out if you're lying, so a particularly calm and calculated criminal could, in theory, fool the polygraph test every time by simply not getting too stressed out when they're asked if they're responsible for the fresh spate of granny murders in Giggleswick. By the same token, a particularly anxious but entirely innocent individual could fail the polygraph every time when they're just trying to truthfully convey what they had for breakfast that morning. There's a pretty good reason why the results of the polygraph tests are not permissible as evidence in trials in the UK and most other sensible nations around the world. They're not reliable enough. And if we really had managed to invent a fully functioning lie detector, then most trials would be over in a matter of minutes. All we'd have to do is ask the defendant a few questions, the most significant of which would be, are you guilty of this crime? The true statistics on accuracy depend on who you believe. Jeremy Kyle might have stated on air that the results were 96% accurate, but even industry groups reckon that they're only about 87% accurate. If only there was some reliable method to check if either Kyle or the industry groups were telling the truth. You see, there's more than just a sprinkle of serious doubt here, as the American Polygraph Association has reported that the results are around 65% accurate, whilst independent tests carried out by psychologists have concluded that the results are closer to 60%. Suddenly, these lie detectors don't seem quite as impressive as they first appear. We're getting close to the point we might as well just be guessing. The really troubling point here is that despite the caption flashing up on the screen to warn viewers that the results might not be entirely reliable, Jeremy Kyle always acted as if the results were 100% accurate. Whenever a guest failed a lie detector test, Jezza would see this as irrefutable proof that the guest was a snivelling little liar, and he would make his feelings and his judgments abundantly clear. This paved the way for another catchphrase dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, so the lie detector is wrong, is it?" The way he saw it, you can't possibly argue with a lie detector that doesn't technically exist and might only be about 60% accurate. And it does make you wonder just how many guests got away with their lies during the show's 14-year run, and how many totally innocent people were branded as liars on national television. A show that appeared to be built on a foundation of hostility and accusation was bound to provoke a few controversial moments along the way when things didn't quite go as planned. One of the most famous incidents is quite tame in the grand scheme of things, but is probably the most watched clip from the entire series, racking up millions of views on YouTube. In this mini-drama dubbed Envelope Gate, a guy called Kevin didn't seem too happy when a paternity test revealed that he was the father of his girlfriend's baby. But rather strangely, Kevin appeared to raise objections to Kyle by throwing the empty envelope on the studio floor after the results were announced. Then, in a bid to either pacify or patronise the guest, Kyle went to the trouble of picking up the empty envelope and handing it to Kevin for safekeeping. But as Kyle turned his back and returned to his spot, Kevin lobbed the envelope at the host and it hit a startled Jezza on the head. Credit due, it was a pretty impressive shot, which Kevin followed up by threatening to knock out Carl. You can see that Carl is clearly rattled as he angrily saunters up to Kevin, almost as if he's considering a physical retaliation, although you're bound to feel a bit braver when you've got security guard Steve and all his mates on your payroll and poised for action. The situation was swiftly de-escalated. And yes, it's hardly an example of shocking graphic violence, but it's still amusing to consider that the most popular seconds of the entire show was a clip of the host getting attacked with an empty envelope. There were, however, far more serious incidents that got out of hand during the recordings of the show, the most famous of which led to a pretty vicious condemnation of the show's format by a district judge. During an episode broadcast in 2007, a guest called David Staniforth was feeling pretty miffed that his wife Jennifer had struck up an affair with their new lodger, a bus driver named Larry. David Staniforth claimed that he had originally had no interest whatsoever in appearing on the show, but the researchers had convinced him that Jennifer might be considering a reconciliation if he turned up and had his say. It quickly became evident that this was not the case at all. Jennifer was sticking with Larry. The bus-driving lodger didn't get much of an opportunity to say anything himself, though, because almost as soon as he walked onto the stage, David leapt up from his chair and brutally head-butted him, bringing the segment to an early, shocking conclusion. Whilst the episode was broadcast, the actual headbutt was blurred out. David Staniforth was later found guilty of common assault and fined £300 for the attack, along with £60 of costs. But whilst Manchester District Judge Alan Burke was obviously not impressed with the actions of the defendant, he was even more scathing of the show itself. He told the defendant, "I have had the misfortune, very recently, of watching the Jeremy Kyle show. It seems to me that the purpose of this show is to effect a morbid and depressing display of dysfunctional people whose lives are in turmoil. It should not surprise anyone that these people, some of whom have limited intellects, become aggressive with each other. This type of incident is exactly what the producers want. These self-righteous individuals should be in the dock with you. They pretend there is some kind of virtue in putting out a show like this." The judge then went on to describe the show as trash and human baiting. So, I think we can conclude that not everyone was a fan. But did that even matter? Love him or loathe him, Jeremy Kyle himself became a household name who is also fronting a string of other ITV shows in prime-time slots, including the topical investigative documentary series The Kyle Files, and a brief stab at an intense game show called High Stakes. The Americans weren't so keen on him. An attempt to take the Jeremy Kyle show over to the US was pulled after 2 seasons following disappointing ratings. But UK viewers did continue to lap it up, and by the time we get to 2019, the Jeremy Kyle show had clocked up over 3,000 episodes and was still regarded as one of the biggest daytime shows on ITV. And whilst the show may have been hailed in some quarters as cruel, exploitative and misleading, there were still busloads of people who were desperate to get onto the show so that the heroic, self-styled pillar of virtue that was Jeremy Kyle could expose the truth and solve all their personal problems within a 16-minute window. One such hopeful character was 63-year-old Steve Dymond from Portsmouth in Hampshire. Steve first met his fiancée Jane Callahan on an online dating site in 2017. By the following year, they were engaged and living together in Jane's home. Steve was a construction worker and a proud former volunteer for the Royal National Lifeboat Institution during his younger days. He was quite a lot more besides, according to Steve himself, who told Jane that he used to serve in the Royal Navy. But this was just one of several porkies that Steve told his fiancée. Although he tried to get in the Royal Navy as a young man, he sadly didn't quite make the cut. In fact, Steve was a habitual fibber and made up all kinds of stuff, including a whole set of grandchildren that he didn't actually have. He wasn't even truthful about his own age. This obviously sounds a bit dodgy, but people who knew Steve reckon that it wasn't like he was an unscrupulous villain who was attempting to deceive everyone with wicked lies. He was more of a lost soul who appeared to be deeply insecure and lacking in confidence. He wanted to constantly impress his partner and was frequently worried that the relationship he treasured so much might end. It's not like he told harmful lies, it's just that sometimes he got a bit too carried away. He also appeared to readily admit that he had just made it up when challenged about it, and was quick to offer an apology. Sadly, the relationship did in fact come to a temporary end in February 2019, when Jane felt that he'd crossed the line and told a fib too far. Some of Steve's Viagra tablets had gone missing, and he hadn't used them with Jane, leading his fiancée to suspect that he had been cheating on her. Steve had no explanation for the missing Viagra tablets, but vehemently insisted that he'd not been cheating on Jane. His fiancée wasn't convinced, the couple split up, and Steve was forced to move back into his old lodgings, a single room in a property in Portsmouth that he rented from a woman named Michelle Thaxter. During this period, he fell into deep depression. However, the split was not permanent. Just 6 weeks later, Steve and Jane attempted a reconciliation. Steve was over the moon when he was invited back into Jane's home, but Jane still felt nagging doubts about his suspected infidelity, which Steve still strongly denied. It's usually reported that it was Steve Dymond's idea to go on the Jeremy Kyle show and take a lie detector test to prove his innocence to his beloved fiancée. We'll never know for sure. It may have been the case that Steve suggested taking a private polygraph test, which would have been quite expensive, and this somehow evolved into a conversation about taking one for free on the Jeremy Kyle show. It's very possible that Jane may have been influential in this decision, and she'd had a bit of previous experience with lie detectors and the Jeremy Kyle show. Although details are sparse, Jane's daughter Sophie had appeared on the show 6 years earlier in 2013 and passed a lie detector test after her boyfriend had accused her of cheating. It's not entirely clear what role Jane herself played in the episode, although it's likely she briefly appeared on stage to support her daughter, who was fully vindicated by the results. Perhaps Jane thought that it was time for Jeremy to help her family again. Her own explanation was a lot simpler though. We just thought Jeremy Kyle would be quicker. Steve Dymond was said to have phoned the show between 40 to 50 times a day in a desperate bid to secure their spot, but it was far from plain sailing. One of the producers felt that the idea had wings and had created a draft headline for their proposed segment: Missing Viagra and Lies About Being in the Navy. Are you a cheat? We're guessing that somebody else came along and polished up the segment titles later on. But the proposal fell apart when it was discovered that Steve had been diagnosed with depression and prescribed antidepressants. The show had a policy to reject applicants for a polygraph test if they were suffering from depression. Steve Dymond wasn't going to take no for an answer though. We'll explore this in more depth later on, but after having his application repeatedly rejected, Steve managed to get a letter from his GP which indicated that his patient's mood had improved and that he was not currently taking any medication for depression. This helped to resolve the matter, and the show was on. Not all of Paul's friends and acquaintances were convinced that it was a good idea. His on and off landlady, Michelle Thaxter, later described Steve as just a really, really nice guy who absolutely adored Jane, but she didn't have much time for the confrontational daytime show. Michelle said, "He'd mentioned before about going on the Jeremy Kyle show, and my words were to him that I think it's stupid because he could hear things he didn't want to hear, but it wasn't my business." But nothing was going to dampen Steve Dymond's excitement as he looked ahead to the 2nd of May 2019, on which the recording would take place of an episode that would never be broadcast. An episode that would precede a devastating human tragedy and kill the career of Jeremy Kyle. Behind the scenes footage does exist of Steve Dymond taking the polygraph test shortly before the cameras started rolling on stage. Steve seems reasonably relaxed and upbeat as he asks the polygrapher a few questions about how the tests work, and he seems encouraged by the responses. The polygrapher also explains that the test is being filmed just to verify that each guest is treated fairly, or to put it another way, they film it to confirm that the test was carried out properly, just in case the guest who fails the test starts kicking off that they've been stitched up like a kipper. Steve is looking noticeably more nervous on stage as recording of the segment actually gets underway though. There he's joined by Jane Callahan as Jezza guides them through their story and allows them to explain Steve's history of habitual lying, including his fibs about his career in the Royal Navy and his entirely fictional grandchildren. Carl also briefly explains that Steve had previously been taking prescribed medication, but glosses over this very quickly with the words, "It doesn't matter what medication," and moves on. Steve admits that he's lied in the past and can't explain why he does it, as he begins to become visibly upset, but he insists that he loves Jane to bits, and he's never once cheated on her, nor has he told any further lies since the reconciliation. Jane is holding Steve's hands, and she tells Carl that she thinks he does love her. During this early questioning, the atmosphere is quite serene for the Jeremy Kyle show. The host is only gently pressing the two guests for details, and the studio audience appear to have taken a shine to this likeable, if slightly befuddled man. When Kyle swings round to the audience and asks them if they think Steve will pass the lie detector test, the positive noises emanating from the crowd seem to suggest that they very much think he will. It's claimed by the show that Carl never knew the results of the polygraph or DNA tests until he opened the envelope on stage. Whether that's true or not is up for debate, but it does seem at this point as if he might just believe in Steve. The mood, however, would quickly change. The lie detector results are in, and had the episode been broadcast, we're assuming that Jezza would have paused for a commercial break and another quick message from the sponsor Foxy Bingo before opening the envelope and announcing the results. We'll be right back. Jeremy Kyle declared that Steve Dymond had failed every single question on the lie detector test. The studio audience immediately began to boo and heckle Steve as if he'd just been unmasked as the villain in a particularly lousy pantomime. Steve himself looks genuinely shell-shocked. As Jane leaves the stage in tears, Steve begins to weep and swears to God that he's never been unfaithful. He's clearly struggling to comprehend the results into which he'd invested so much faith. The host has no sympathy. He brands Steve a serial liar whom he wouldn't trust with a chocolate button, and Carl gets a chance to hurl out a variant on one of his popular catchphrases in the face of a bewildered Steve. Why don't you grow a pair and tell the goddamn truth? Perhaps you can see where Kyle is coming from here. The verdict, in a nutshell, appears to be self-confessed serial liar fails lie detector test. But when the drama moves backstage, where sobbing Steve Dymond expresses his confusion over the results and continues to plead his innocence, a sneering Carl asks him, "So my test's wrong, yeah?" The host then goes on to say something to Jane which doesn't get nearly enough attention. He says, "He failed that test categorically. Just so you're aware, we stand 100% by that." If the episode had been broadcast, there's no doubt that the usual caption would have been displayed on screen, but Carl himself had now gone several steps beyond falsely suggesting that the tests were around 96% accurate, and was here clearly stating that the show stood 100% by the categorical results. A distressed Jane was equally convinced by the test results, and it was obvious that the relationship was now over as the pair eventually left the studio separately. Steve had spent time with an aftercare nurse and a producer before he made his way out. He later returned to the property of Michelle Thaxter and resumed his rental of the single room. Michelle later revealed the man was broken. He was crying. He literally had nowhere else to go. He said he'd called his mum, but she didn't want to have anything to do with him. I've never seen a man crying like that. Steve did manage to speak with his estranged son, Carl Woolley, with whom he'd not spoken for a number of years for reasons that never were disclosed. Carl had been encouraged to get in touch by Steve's brother, who had explained to him that his dad was feeling low following the disastrous turn of events on the show. During the course of the first phone call, Steve learned for the first time that he was a grandfather. The pair spoke on the phone frequently over the next few days, although Carl later revealed that the conversations always quickly circled back to his dad's experience on the Jeremy Kyle show. Steve had conveyed how he just couldn't understand how he'd failed the test, why he'd been wrongfully cast as a liar, and why the whole audience had turned on him for something he'd never done. Carl became worried when the telephone calls stopped after a few days. Michelle Thaxter had also grown concerned by the 9th of May, as she hadn't seen any sign of Steve for 4 days. On that day, while she was out of the house, she received a phone call from her son, who tried to take a peek into Steve's room from his mum's balcony, and he didn't like what he thought he could see. Michelle returned home and entered the rented room, where she found the body of Steve Dymond. An empty bottle of morphine tablets was found close to the body, and it was later concluded at the inquest that Steve had taken his own life. The actual cause of death was an overdose of morphine combined with left ventricular hypertrophy, an existing heart condition. A small funeral, paid for by Portsmouth City Council, was held at Kingston Cemetery in Portsmouth. Just 5 people attended the short service: Jane Callahan, her 3 daughters, and her son-in-law. Steve Dymond was buried in an unmarked and now long neglected grave. Daytime television viewers first got wind that something might be amiss when they tried to tune into the Jeremy Kyle show on the 13th of May. Just to be clear, this would not have been the episode to feature Steve Dymond, as the episodes were recorded weeks in advance. But in fact, the viewers that morning were not to be treated to any new episode at all of the Jeremy Kyle show, as they drank their coffee and tucked in to those soggy Weetabix. The show was replaced at the last minute with a repeat of Dickinson's Real Deal, with no explanation. It wasn't until the following day that a statement from ITV revealed that the broadcasting and recording of the Jeremy Kyle show had been suspended following the death of a participant. Recording would not resume until a review of the episode in which he featured had been conducted. The statement expressed how everyone at ITV and the Jeremy Kyle show were shocked and saddened to hear the death of the as-yet unnamed participant. The show not only disappeared from the schedules, but any trace of it was also removed from the on-demand service ITV Hub. It felt at the time, perhaps unfairly, that there was an alarming new pattern forming with people taking their own lives after appearing on reality television. Just a couple of months earlier, the footballer and former Love Island contestant Mike Thalasitis had taken his own life, whilst the previous year, the model and former Love Island contestant Sophie Graddon had taken the same tragic path. There was naturally much speculation drawn about potential connections between the aftermath of appearing on Love Island and the deaths of these two young people. It's a complex topic which we won't dive into here, but it's worth emphasising that in each case there was a significant gap between the broadcast of the episodes and the deaths. In Mike's case, it was 18 months, and in Sophie's case, it was close to 2 years. Both had been suffering with harassment and mental health issues for some time. There were also tragic deaths relating directly to either the Jeremy Kyle show or other shows fronted by our man with the lie detector. 31-year-old Natasha Redican had worked as a producer on the very episode of the Jeremy Kyle show that featured Steve Dymond and Jane Callahan. She took her own life 9 months later in February 2020. Former colleagues anonymously suggested that Natasha was brilliant but vulnerable, and that she was racked with guilt after Steve Dymond's death. There was also a lot more going on to the story, though. Natasha was battling with depression and anxiety, and had struggled to find work following the suspension of the Jeremy Kyle show. The coroner stated at the inquest that Natasha had a history of taking intentional overdoses, and the motivations of her actions were multifaceted. A case with more direct parallels to the death of Steve Dymond concerns a 36-year-old woman named Erica Pawson, who participated in a TV show that never actually made it onto the television. During the very same year that the Jeremy Kyle show was launched on ITV in 2005, Kyle also fronted a pilot episode for a potential Channel 5 show called Britain's Worst Husband. The format wasn't a million miles away from the ITV show. Kyle offered his supposedly expert relationship advice in his typically confrontational manner to married couples who were going through a rough patch with the help of lie detectors. During a segment featuring Erica Pawson and her problem husband Paul, the host clearly wasn't too impressed with Paul after he failed a string of polygraph tests. Kyle repeatedly urged Paul to leave his wife of 18 years for her own good, and Paul Pawson agreed to do so with immediate effect. Just 6 days after the recording, Erica Pawson was found dead after taking her own life. Paul Pawson later accused Jeremy Kyle of being an aggressive bully who destroyed his and his daughter's life, although it's interesting that he didn't take the time to mention his late wife in the same breath. Erica's own father revealed that he didn't blame the show, as there were severe problems brewing long before the recording, whilst the coroner suspected that serious marital difficulties contributed to Erica's actions. Britain's Worst Husband was buried before it could be broadcast, and it has to be said, the death of Erica Pawson was largely forgotten. But if there were any lessons here to be learned about the potential risks of wheeling out vulnerable people to be forcefully questioned, judged and advised by an entirely unqualified man, then they went unheeded. The still new Jeremy Kyle show stuck with a very familiar, similar formula for the following 14 years, until the death of Steve Dymond changed everything. The suspension of the show initially felt as if it might just be a temporary break to give ITV enough time to confirm that no blame could be pinned on the production. But it wasn't long before we heard a chorus of influential demands for the show's immediate and permanent cancellation. Some of the people calling for the chop included psychiatrists, members of Parliament, and the former executive chairman of ITV, Michael Grade. A statement from 10 Downing Street described the incident as deeply concerning. But the show still boasted some prominent supporters, perhaps the most surprising of whom was Emma Kenny, the resident psychologist of ITV's This Morning. Emma took to Twitter with her feelings on the controversy. Quote, "If the show gets banned, then you better be ready for 100 other shows to follow. You may not like it, and you certainly don't have to, but people have a right to watch and a right to be a contributor. That's democracy and freedom of choice right there. There's this mentality that all the contributors are completely vulnerable idiots who wander blindly onto the set only to be bullied mercilessly by the audience and staff. It's bizarre. If you don't like it, then don't watch and don't apply. Broadcaster Piers Morgan expressed similar sentiments. As everyone piles on Jeremy Kyle, I like to say he's a great guy, an excellent broadcaster, and hugely popular with the vast majority of people who watched and appeared, voluntarily, on his top-rated show. So much snobbery and hypocrisy being spewed by his critics. These people are going on television. No one is forcing them to. You can check people as much as they like, but ultimately, if they want to do it, they know the show they're appearing on, and they know what will happen. Jeremy Kyle later declared that Piers Morgan and broadcaster Kate Garraway were the only two people who reached out to him and offered support, glumly noting, "You find out who your friends are." However, the opinions of Kyle's friends were not going to be enough to save the show. On the 15th of May, just one day after suspension, ITV Chief Executive Caroline McCall announced that the show had been permanently axed, in a statement which offered condolences to the bereaved, whilst also appearing to pay tribute to the show itself. They read, "Given the gravity of recent events, we've decided to end production of The Jeremy Kyle Show. The Jeremy Kyle Show has had a loyal audience and has been made by a dedicated production team for 14 years. But now is the right time for the show to end. Everyone at ITV's thoughts and sympathies are with the family and friends of Steve Dymond." The swiftness of the decision caught many people off guard. It was speculated that ITV would at least conduct a lengthy internal review and await the coroner's verdict before making a call on the show's future. But it's believed that in the face of such fierce public opinion and strong criticism, ITV had no real choice other than to bow to pressure on this one. The network did make it clear, though, that they still fully supported Jeremy Kyle. ITV's director of television, Kevin Lygo, believed that Kyle was, quote, "a consummate broadcaster," and felt that it would be absolutely wrong to apportion blame of the show against the presenter of it. Kevin Lygo also later revealed that the network was also already committed to producing another series of the documentary series The Kyle Files, whilst they were also working with Kyle on a pilot for a brand new primetime show. Kyle's future with ITV seemed secure. It's funny how things pan out, though. No details were ever released about the mysterious pilot, which was never commissioned for a series. And despite Logo's claim that the network was already committed to another series of The Kyle Files, it was another series that failed to materialise. It gradually became clear that ITV was no longer interested in working with Jeremy Kyle in any capacity. So it looked as if the unemployed consummate broadcaster would have to get off his lazy backside and get a job. Whilst Kyle was busy filling out his job application forms, very little time was wasted in asking some serious questions about what went wrong here. Within the space of a couple of months, the death of Steve Dymond had prompted an inquiry into reality television by the Digital, Culture, Media and Sports Commons Committee. The scope of the inquiry extended beyond the confines of Jeremy Kyle's studio. The committee were examining the wider topics of whether production companies were providing adequate care for potentially vulnerable participants, whether the fundamental design formats were placing participants under unfair psychological pressure, and how the future of reality television may need to adapt to evolving attitudes on mental health. However, it was only natural that the recent events relating to the Jeremy Kyle Show were going to come under particularly close scrutiny, and that members of the show's personnel would be invited to appear in front of the committee. There's one person who everyone was expecting to see, and if you want a clue, his name's in the title of the show. The committee chairman, Damian Collins, had similar thoughts. He confirmed that an invitation had been extended to Kyle, whom he considered an important witness, as the whole show was based around the presenter. But Damian Collins later confirmed that Kyle had declined to appear. And whilst this snub infuriated many members of Parliament, there wasn't a great deal they could do, as Kyle couldn't be legally compelled to accept an invitation. The committee could, in theory, have pushed for a summons if they felt that his presence was critical, but this would have been a highly unusual move, and it was not pursued in this case. Kyle remained largely silent on the matter for a good 5 years, and often claimed that he was unable to speak up for legal reasons. But it's difficult to think of any solid legal reasons that would have prevented him from appearing before a parliamentary committee. It's perhaps more likely that he didn't fancy getting a taste of his own medicine and facing a judgmental interrogation from members of Parliament. This response from his critics was loud and clear. "Oi, Jezza, why don't you grow a pair? Other key personnel did bother to turn up, including the show's psychotherapist Graham Stanier, who offered a robust defence of the show. Sadly, security guard Steve had not been extended an invitation, but the whole inquiry ultimately felt a bit lame and useless, really. Not to mention unfinished. Perhaps the most prominent member of the production team to face a grilling from the committee was executive producer Tom McLennan, but he didn't really seem to know much at all. He was questioned by Damian Collins on the accuracy of the polygraph tests and how much research had gone into the reliability of the results, and why they were using such a flawed method to determine an outcome that could potentially have such a huge impact on people's lives. Tom McLennan's response may as well have been accompanied by a casual shrug. He said it was known that the results weren't 100% accurate, but that he didn't know how reliable they were, as he was not, quote, a lie detector expert. He also said in his defence that it was always made clear that the results were not 100% accurate, but didn't expand on this to explain why it wasn't made clearer that the results may only be around 60% accurate, why the host often made unfounded references to them being around 96% accurate, or why the host always behaved as if the tests were utterly flawless. Damian Collins found that this lack of knowledge was astonishing and branded the producers of the show irresponsible, whilst the committee accused ITV Studios of a corporate failure of responsibility towards the show's guests. But that's about as far as we got. The inquiry came to an abrupt halt following the announcement of a snap election in 2019, and it was never resumed. Maybe we'd get something a little more conclusive from the coroner's inquest. During the pre-inquest interviews held in 2020, the senior coroner for Hampshire, Jason Pegg, made it known that Jeremy Kyle himself would definitely be considered an interested person in the inquest, and that an act or omission on behalf of the host may possibly have caused or contributed to the death of Steve Dymond. He added that it would seem ludicrous not to have Kyle at the inquest to give evidence and deliver his take on the situation. In other words, there'd be no squiggling out of this one, as Kyle had been legally compelled to attend the inquest. Jason Pegg did emphasise, though, that the scope of the inquest into Steve Dymond's death should not be considered a detailed, top-to-bottom inquiry into the Jeremy Kyle show. Anyone interested in the outcome would need a big dollop of patience, though, as we have to wait slightly longer than the length of a commercial break to hear the results. Although the inquest was tentatively scheduled for the following year, a number of factors, such as the backlog in cases accumulated during the COVID pandemic, multiple bereavements for the Dymond family, and various other delays, the inquest was pushed all the way back to 2024. In the meantime, fresh allegations were slowly emerging from the woodwork, and very little of it was casting the Jeremy Kyle show in a favourable light. Much of this new information was coming from whistleblowers who had experience from the inside and were now spilling the breakfast beans to the media. Of particular significance was the 2022 documentary miniseries broadcast on Channel 4 entitled Jeremy Kyle Show: Death on Daytime, which featured contributions from 4 ex-employees whose words were spoken by actors as they preferred to remain anonymous. A picture was painted of researchers constantly under enormous pressure to secure guests for the show, a pretty tall order considering the number of guests required to fill up the running time 5 days a week. The researchers felt as if their jobs were always at risk if they didn't make it near the top of a physical leaderboard that charted how many good stories they've managed to find, with extra points dished out for appealing segments, such as a segment that includes 2 guests taking lie detector tests. If the researchers were struggling to deliver the goods, then they'd often end up working between 9 p.m. and 6 a.m. the following morning in a desperate bid not to get fired. One former producer claimed that she and several other members of staff were actually refused meals if they hadn't booked in enough fresh guests. One side effect of this desperate rush to find guests was that any potential mental health issues might occasionally be downplayed to avoid the story getting rejected. Whilst the mental health checklist was supposedly in place to eliminate the risk of a particularly vulnerable individual facing Jeremy Kyle, the details were sometimes manipulated to ensure a hard pass, or as one researcher quite bluntly put it, you would quite often lie. All of this does raise the question of where exactly they found the guests. It's been suggested that the researchers resorted to hanging around rough council estates or branches of Poundland in the hope that they might just walk into an argument that needed resolving. In fact, the majority of stories came from the viewers themselves, who called the telephone number that frequently flashed up on the screen during a typical episode. As the show received an avalanche of calls every day, you might think that the researchers should have had it easy, but it wasn't quite as simple as that. Many of the stories were simply not interesting enough to drag out onto TV. And even when a particularly juicy story popped up from one half of a dispute, the researchers would often struggle to get the other half of the dispute on board. When the well was running dry, researchers followed up leads from personal stories published in newspapers and magazines to try and convince the subject to appear on the show. A woman who shared her harrowing story of sexual abuse in the National Woman's magazine was bombarded with calls for 3 days as the researchers offered her ever bigger incentives to tell her story on television. Another obvious question to ask here is why on earth anyone in their right minds would want to appear on the Jeremy Kyle show in the first place, bearing in mind that they're likely to be shouted at and potentially humiliated in front of 1 million viewers. Yes, there are always going to be some people who just want to appear on TV or perhaps meet their hero in the flesh. For example, Jane Callahan appeared to be something of a fan of Jeremy Kyle. We can glean a few clues about this from her multiple appearances on the show and the fact that she had a tattoo of Jeremy Kyle's signature on her arm, which she quite incredibly had done after Steve's death. Incidentally, Jane initially revealed on the Channel 4 documentary that she didn't blame Kyle for the tragedy. She said of Jezza, "I love him. I do feel sorry for him for all the backlash he got. I don't blame him for it. I can't put the blame on someone when I'm partly to blame as well." But Jane had a complete change of heart after watching the documentary and hearing some of the behind-the-scenes revelations for the first time. She later told the Mirror that the tattoo of the signature now made her feel as if she had poison in her arm, and she has since had it covered up with a floral tribute to Steve. There are other compelling reasons why a guest might choose to appear on the show, though, not least of which is the fact that the DNA tests and polygraph tests are quite expensive and beyond the budget of many people. The show was offering to do it quickly and for free. Whilst it's all very well for the likes of Piers Morgan suggest that these primitive working class people know exactly what they're signing up for and deserve everything they get, the truth is that many of the guests would have considered it to be the only feasible option on the table. It's likely that the couple Paul and Lee would ideally have preferred to learn in private that they were half-brothers, but getting results announced on national television was the best option at the time. But what kind of treatment was a guest likely to receive when appearing on the show? Whistleblowers claimed that Jeremy Kyle himself was an unpleasant character with a god complex who often lost his temper with the production team, and he didn't seem to hold the guests in the highest regard either. The Channel 4 documentary exposed audio recordings from behind the scenes in which an exasperated Kyle is berating one of the staff about the guests he was working with out there on stage. He moans, "They're terrible guests. You've done it again. They're thick as shit." On a more comical note, he's also heard ranting at one point, "Would Philip Schofield have to put up with this?" It's maybe a great surprise that Kyle displayed the same contempt backstage that he openly displayed in public. But other members of the production team also admitted to treating guests in ways that left a lot to be desired. Conflicted families were often separated into different rooms when they arrived at the studio, and then fed lies by staff about nasty gossip the other party had supposedly been saying in an effort to get them all wound up. Guests with drug problems would also be fed lies about having to compete with people in other segments to grab the single spot in rehab that was being made available, as Carl would only be choosing the person he felt most deserved it on that day. In truth, of course, every guest was offered a place in rehab if they asked for it, which is very nice of the show, but remember, all that involved was phoning around the guests' local services. But by making it out to be tough competition, vulnerable addicts were fired up to give a stronger performance for the cameras and increase the chances of a livelier show. Some of the guests felt that they were royally stitched up by the production team at every turn. One guy, who used to be a drug dealer, turned up wearing a stylish jumper, which he was told that he couldn't wear on the show as it featured a branded logo. That might seem fair enough, but the only replacement garment offered by the production team was an unflattering, cheap tracksuit. The show apparently had a habit of dressing up guests to kind of fit a stereotypical narrative, and this one seemed especially mean when Jeremy Kyle later turned on the guest during recording and sneerily described him as just a ex-drug dealer in a tracksuit. Other guests were misled about making an appearance on the show in the first place, too. If the researchers were battling to get one half of a story to participate, the individual would be led to believe that it might lead to a positive outcome. For example, they might be given the hopeful news that their estranged partner was seriously seeking reconciliation, only to discover on the day that nothing like this was ever on the cards, and they were only there to be chewed up and spat out by Jezza. This apparently happened quite a lot, most notably in the case we mentioned earlier regarding David Staniforth, who went on to headbutt his wife's new lover on stage. On a more disturbing note relating directly to the Steve Dymond episode, it also became apparent that the production team could have shown a little more care and compassion in this case. Some members of the team formed a WhatsApp group to communicate to each other during the recording and aftermath of the show. The messages sent during the Steve Dymond episode were revealed for the first time during the pre-inquest interviews in 2019. Just prior to Steve taking the stage, a producer had sent the following considerate message. "Could you pop down and see Mr. Dymond, who wants to meet you? Could be emotional. He's had tears in his eyes twice. Lol. X." Another message sent after the recording gave a brief update on the well-being of the guest. Quote, "Just so you know, he's still crying. I think it's still being in this room going around in circles. He's just said, I wish I was dead. Just a heads up." Shortly after this message was sent, Steve Dymond was allowed to leave the studio. The Channel 4 documentary miniseries provoked fresh ripples of outrage across the nation, and it's only fair that ITV and Jeremy Kyle himself should be given the right to reply. ITV denied the central allegation that there was a bad culture at the heart of the Jeremy Kyle show and declared that it would never condone the idea of production staff misleading or blatantly lying to guests. The broadcaster also pointed out that the show had a dedicated guest welfare team of mental health professionals who supported every guest before, during and after filming. Critics did make the point that it was a bit strange how ITV was so quick to axe the show if they always had such unshakable confidence in its moral conduct, although as we mentioned earlier, this could have been a case of appearing to be proactive in the face of public pressure. Jeremy Kyle was, however, tight-lipped on the matter. Things had moved on for him a little by this point. After the consummate broadcaster was completely shunned by ITV, he'd gone completely off the radar for a couple of years before making a low-key return to broadcasting in September 2021. He presented the talk radio show Drive Time 4 times a week before briefly moving back in front of the camera in 2022 for a show on Talk TV entitled Jeremy Kyle Live. In this new format, he thankfully resisted the urge to try and solve everyone's problems and was instead content with just interviewing reasonably well-known guests and reviewing the topical issues of the day with a panel of journalists. Whilst viewing figures are not available, it's safe to say that the size of the audience would have been a far cry from the days when he was pulling in 1 million viewers a day. The whole Talk TV channel was considered to be a flop with an average viewing time of just 8 seconds, and it's since been forced to move into a streaming model. Back when the Channel 4 documentary was aired, Kyle was still presenting his Drive Time show on Talk Radio, and he only had this to say to his listeners. "Let's just deal with the elephant in the room straight away. I've maintained a consistent approach over the last 3 years. I have said that I will not comment on the tragic death of Steve Dymond until the legal process is finished, and that is a position that I will maintain. When, and trust me, there will be a time after the inquest, when it is proper for me to have my say, because there are two sides to every story, I will do it here." That didn't turn out to be an accurate prophecy, as Jezza was no longer presenting a show on the radio or on Talk TV when the full inquest finally got underway on the 3rd of September 2024. It was an excruciatingly long wait, but the time had finally come for Jeremy Kyle to have his say, whether he liked it or not. A large roll call of other witnesses turned up to have their say at the inquest of Steve Dymond, held over 5 days at Winchester Coroner's Court. Senior Coroner for Hampshire, Jason Pegg, again emphasised at the very beginning that nobody was on trial here and that the scope of the inquest did not include addressing the broader systematic issues of participating in reality television. The long list of witnesses included Jane Callahan, members of Steve's family, Steve's GP, members of the show's Aftercare team, and Chris Wisson, the director of content compliance at ITV. And it was through the testimony of these witnesses that we first began to form the complete picture of the events that led from Steve Dymond's decision to make an application for the Jeremy Kyle show right through to his harrowing death. It was revealed that Steve had first been diagnosed with a depressive disorder way back in 1995 and had taken overdoses in an attempt to end his own life at least 3 times between 1995 and 2005. He was also sectioned for a brief time in 2005. There had been no attempts to take his own life over the following 14 years, but his GP, Dr. Amjad Rehman, became concerned in March 2019 following the temporary split between Steve and Jane Callahan. Steve had admitted to having thoughts of not wanting to go on, and Dr. Rehman made an urgent referral to the acute mental health care team. Steve was then swiftly referred back to the community health team under Dr. Rehman's supervision, as he was deemed to be a low-risk patient who'd been experiencing reactive episodes to the very recent split with Jane. The following month, Steve turned up to the surgery in an agitated state and without an appointment, demanding a very specific letter. By this time, Steve and Jane had reconciled and had already decided to make an application for the Jeremy Kyle show, but the applications had been turned down as Steve was taking antidepressants. Steve explained to the nurse practitioner on duty that he urgently needed a doctor's letter to confirm that he was fit to appear on a television show, and then tried to hand over his antidepressants as he no longer needed them. He became upset when the nurse practitioner refused to take the tablets, told him that there was no GP available to see him without an appointment, and then relayed a message that the doctor would be reluctant to write such a letter. Steve eventually got an appointment with Dr. Amjad Rehman about a fortnight later. Dr. Rehman told the inquest that Steve had appeared in quite an aggressive mood on that day, kicking open the door with his foot and then practically begging for a letter. In the doctor's own words, quote, "I didn't know what he was doing on the TV show. He said it was to prove something to his fiancée. It was a matter of life or death for him." Dr. Rehman did seem surprisingly vague there. He didn't ask the patient for specific details about the purpose of the letter, although this may have meant very little to him anyway, as he'd never even heard of the Jeremy Kyle show. We assume the doctor wasn't a daytime TV kind of guy. The doctor did agree to write an open letter for Steve, but it was remarkably brief. It read, "I write to confirm that Mr. Dymond is registered with this practice. Mr. Dymond has a history of low mood and depression, but his mood has improved since he got back together with his partner. I saw him for review at the surgery today, and his mood has improved, and he's not taking any antidepressants at this time. I hope you will find this information helpful." Jeremy Kyle's barrister, Neil Sheldon KC, didn't seem entirely impressed by this, noting that the letter made no reference to Steve's earlier attempts to take his own life, or how he'd very recently been referred to the acute mental health team after harbouring thoughts of making further attempts. The barrister challenged the doctor. "You wrapped all that information up into a comment in the letter that he has a history of low mood and depression." Dr. Amjad Rehman had little of value to say other than, "I wrote that he had a history of depression." It's worth noting that the doctor did refuse Steve's request to outright declare that the patient was no longer suffering from depression. The doctor's letter landed on the lap of Steve McDonald, a registered mental health nurse who was a member of the show's Aftercare team and who would be responsible for assessing whether Steve was fit to appear on the show and take a polygraph test. Steph was not aware of Steve's history of taking overdoses, and she told the inquest that she would have expected a GP to have mentioned this in the letter. She wasn't trying to pass the buck here, though. Steph had carried out her own mental health assessment of Steve and found him to be confident and upbeat. Steve had claimed to her that he'd never tried to take his own life and never been referred to a mental health team and was no longer on antidepressants. The last part might have been true, but the first two claims were the kind of lies that had already landed Steve in so much trouble with his relationship. Steph McDonald told the inquest that she took everything at face value and it was her own assessment that led to Steve's participation rather than the doctor's letter. When asked if she would have rejected the application had the full picture been clearer, Steph admitted, "I can't 100% say." Steve Dymond had managed to secure what he so desperately wanted, even if the route was a little foggy. On the day of the recording, one of the first things he had to do after arriving at the studio was get hooked up to the polygraph test. Footage was shown at the inquest of Steve taking the test and asking a few questions to the polygraphers about how it all worked, and at one point during this footage, which of course was never intended to be broadcast, Steve asks the polygrapher if it's true that the test is 99.9% accurate, and the polygrapher responds with, "No. That's DNA testing." It's refreshing to see a bit of honesty at work here. But hang on a sec. The polygrapher is about to destroy the mood. He goes on to say that polygraphs are about 95%, between 93 and 95%, so it's very accurate, but we're very careful. It's actually quite heartbreaking to see Steve Dymond's face light up in sheer relief when he hears this. He really seems to think that if he just tells the truth, everything is going to work out for him. But just where were they pulling these figures from? It's a question that naturally cropped up at the inquest, but nobody really had any answers. A senior producer had previously given a police statement in which he declared that the results were 96% accurate, a number often bandied about on the show by the host. But when it was shown to the inquest that independent experts had put the true figure closer to 60%, nobody could really explain the discrepancy. ITV's Director of Content Compliance, Chris Wisson, was excused from even answering the question as he'd adopted the same strategy as executive producer Tom McLennan at the Parliamentary hearing by shrugging his shoulders and saying that he wasn't a lie detector expert. It seems that nobody involved in the show was an expert on polygraph tests, but it was still considered acceptable to give viewers the impression that they were 96% accurate. Of course, we know the distraught outcome of Steve Dymond's polygraph test, but we'll never know if he was telling the truth. What we do know, though, is that he was a very nervous individual who was pinning all his future hopes on this test, and that's just the kind of person who's more likely to fail a test when telling the gospel truth, and his genuine, shell-shocked reaction upon hearing the results suggests that he really can't believe how this has happened. He was under the impression that there was about a 5% chance, rather than a more realistic 40% chance, that the polygraph test would deliver the wrong result. Following the immediate shock outcome of the polygraph test, Jane Callahan told the inquest that she didn't really communicate with Steve backstage before they separately left the studio. She said that Carl had told her that the show had faith in the accuracy of the tests and that she shouldn't bother with Steve as he was a waste of time. Jane felt at this point that she just wanted to get Steve out of her life. ITV's Chris Wissom told the inquest that nobody on the show felt any sense of crisis when Steve left the studio. Wissom had already gone into detail about the mental health checks that were put into place before approving guests, and pointed out that the show had a policy of not offering a polygraph test to anyone currently diagnosed with depression. He'd also insisted that the central purpose of the show was to hopefully resolve problems through discussion. When the barrister for Steve Dymond's family, Maya Sickand KC, challenged Wisson about whether the true purpose of the show was to help people or to produce a show that would make pots of money, Wisson acknowledged her point but argued that the two concepts were not mutually exclusive. Wisson explained to the inquest that Steve had remained in the studio for around an hour and 45 minutes after recording, and he was crying throughout much of this time. Steve was given a brief welfare check, known in the studio as a corridor check, which amounted to a member of the Aftercare team informing Steve that they were around in case he needed them. A producer also spent about half an hour trying to reassure and comfort Steve as he wept. Nobody felt especially concerned about Steve's welfare as he left the studio, and a member of the production team contacted him the very next day to check in on how things were doing. The landlady, Michelle Thaxter, told the inquest how she and her son came across the body of Steve Dymond in his room just 6 days after this call. More harrowing details emerged at the inquest as Steve's final WhatsApp message to Jane Callahan was read out. The following words were sent the day before he took his life. "This will be the last time I say it. I was never, never ever unfaithful to you in all the time we were together. I hope the Jeremy Kyle Show is so happy now as to what they have done to me. I did lie about my past, but not about me being a cheat. I never ever did cheat on you. They are responsible for what happens now. I hope this makes good ratings for them. I bet they keep this quiet. Never did I cheat on you. Never, never. My final words. I did try to explain to you, but you would not listen." Steve also penned a final note which was found in the room when his body was discovered 2 days after he'd taken the overdose. The note included the words, "I pushed and pushed for the Jeremy Kyle Show to prove to Jane I never ever did cheat on her, but it all went wrong. I failed because I lied about my past. Now I've lost you forever. I'm a liar, not a cheat. I never ever cheat on Jane, and that's what's tearing me to pieces. Everyone thinks I am, but I'm not a cheat. But I did tell her lies, so much lies, and that's why she didn't believe me. I just don't want to be here no more. My life feels empty without Jane. I love her so much." After 5 years of almost complete silence on the matter, Jeremy Kyle finally took to the stand on the 5th of September. He began by stating that he was not involved in the screening of the guests, and that as far as he knew in this case, Steve had been cleared to appear on the show by a letter from his GP. When challenged about his humiliating behaviour towards Steve Dymond, the host insisted that he could see empathy in his own manner when viewing back the footage. Carl said, "From the moment Steve Dymond came out, I called him mate, I called him pal. I de-escalated, I calmed it down, I pushed it backstage, and that was what the show was all about. Conflict resolution." It could be argued that calling somebody mate or pal doesn't necessarily come across as a friendly term. If you accidentally spill the pint of a stranger who promptly threatens to knock your lights out, pal, you usually assume that he's not wanting to become best buds. Carl also defended the way in which he loudly advised Steve to grow a pair and tell the goddamn truth. He again argued that this was another attempt at de-escalation and that he believed Steve needed to be strongly persuaded to tell the truth in order to save his relationship. So it seems that Carl was convinced that Steve was lying, but he couldn't know for sure. I mean, let's remember, he's not a lie detector expert. Carl's own barrister, Neil Sheldon QC, asked his client what may have seemed like an unusual question. "Did you pounce on Mr. Dymond? Did you heckle him, get in his face, call him a traitor, call him a failure?" This sounds more like an accusatory question that might be asked by somebody who wasn't on Carl's side, but as Carl had technically not done any of these very specific things, he was able to honestly answer no, and came across as a thoroughly placid human being. Neil Sheldon may as well have asked Jezza if he tied Steve Dymond to a torture rack, smeared him in nectar, and let loose a jar of angry bees into the studio. When asked about his feelings on Steve Dymond's final WhatsApp message, particularly the bit in which Steve says, "The Jeremy Kyle Show is responsible for what happens now," the host had this to say: "I know there was an oil tanker of text messages and WhatsApps. There's not one that complains about my behaviour." In other words, Steve was clearly placing responsibility on the show itself rather than its presenter, and Carl didn't have any qualms about chucking everybody else under the bus. And this brings us to an interesting point about Jeremy Kyle's perception of his own role and status on the show. He felt compelled to make it known that it was not his show. He didn't create it or own it. It was just a show with his name that he happened to present. And this is a far cry from the impression that he gave on screen when he regularly ordered guests to, quote, "get off my stage," and even referred to the polygraph tests as my tests. But Carl argued that his persona on screen was a character and a part that evolved over time as the show developed. He later expanded on this a little during an interview with one of his two chums, Kate Garraway, although he didn't seem very clear about it himself. In his own rather fuzzy words, "When I say character, that's the wrong way to describe it. I mean, I would never be that combative or that direct in real life, strangely enough. I think I always went home and became completely different. So it became, it was a character, to be fair." The character known as Jeremy Kyle, whoever he may or may not be, had finally spoken up during an inquest that reached a conclusion on the 10th of September 2024. The results are in. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back. Senior coroner Jason Pegg concluded that a number of factors may have contributed to Steve Dymond's distress and the decision to take his own life. But he felt there was no causal link between the Jeremy Kyle Show and Steve Dymond's death. Here's a heavily condensed version of Jason Pegg's findings. The deceased's decision to take his own life was made in the context of his mental distress that was probably exacerbated by his belief that a significant relationship had now irretrievably broken down following his participation on a television program where it had been suggested that the deceased had lied to his partner. There are a number of possibilities as to why Steve was distressed following the reveal of the results. Possible examples could be that Steve had indeed been telling the truth. It's possible Steve was being manipulative or appreciated the consequence of the impact to his relationship. Aftercare records indicate Steve Dymond was emotionally contained and expressed no dissatisfaction towards his treatment during the recording with a plan for follow-up CBT support. There is nothing in those notes where Mr. Dymond is critical of his treatment by the show. Steve Dymond had a history of a diagnosed personality disorder and mental illness which presented on a number of occasions before any appearance of the show and resulted in self-harming or displaying thoughts of taking his life. Having considered the evidence carefully, there's an absence of reliable evidence that demonstrates that Steve Dymond's appearance on the Jeremy Kyle Show probably caused or contributed to his death. To do so would be speculative. It would be unsafe to infer these links in the absence of a clear and reliable causal connection. Steve Dymond's participation in the show is one of a number of factors, and whilst possible that the manner of his experience added to his distress, it is not probable. ITV's public response was to give itself a pat on the back for its comprehensive duty of care processes as vaguely endorsed by the coroner, and to announce their commitment to evolving and strengthening their industry-leading standards for the selection, protection and support of participants on their shows. ITV also briefly extended its deepest sympathies to those close to Steve Dymond. Jeremy Kyle's public statement, read out by his spokesperson rather than the man himself, had little to say about Steve Dymond and felt more like a defiant fist pump. Jeremy Kyle is pleased that His Majesty's coroner has today clearly and unequivocally found that Jeremy Kyle did not in any way cause or contribute to the tragic death of Steve Dymond. He is now exonerated of that ill-informed accusation, and his name has finally been cleared. Out of respect for Mr. Dymond and the judicial process, Jeremy has always maintained that it would be inappropriate to discuss details whilst the legal inquest was ongoing, and he has remained steadfastly silent in the face of lies, false accusations and unfair criticism over the last 5.5 years. This has taken a huge toll on him and his family, and he would like to thank everyone who has truly supported him through these tough times. The sense of triumph may have been a little over the top, particularly when using words such as exonerated, or claiming that Carl had been clearly and unequivocally found not to be at fault. Let's not forget that the coroner had simply concluded that Steve's participation in the show was one of many factors, and that it was still possible, but not probable, that it had contributed to Steve's distress. But Jeremy Kyle was taking this as an emphatic win. On a slightly different note, Steve's son Carl observed, "The only good thing that came from my father's death is that the Jeremy Kyle show is cancelled." Jezza may have kept silent for 5 years, but he had a lot more to say following the ruling, and whilst he always made an obligatory reference to the death of Steve Dymond's death, his main focus was on complaining about his own predicament and his perceived cancellation. He recalled that following the axing of the show, he became completely demotivated and developed anxiety about even leaving the house. Perhaps that's not too surprising, as under the protection of security guard Steve, he could feasibly have been beaten up during a Tesco shopping trip by one of the many people that he pissed off in front of the cameras. Carl was eventually prescribed antidepressants for a while, but only after his wife dragged him to the doctors. He gave an interview to The Sun in late 2024, in which he claimed that he took pride in his work on the show, that conflicts were resolved, and the thousands of people who were placed into rehab following their appearances. He also said that his conscience was clear, as Steve Dymond had been cleared to appear on the show by the show's Aftercare team and Steve's own GP, although the latter point is arguable, as Dr. Amtev Rehman was not even aware of the show. Carl admitted that he probably didn't get it right every time, and said he understood why the show had to fall as a result of the tragedy. He told The Sun, "I get it though. This is TV from a bygone era, and it would, quite rightly, not ever be put on again today. People watched to make themselves feel better about their own lives, but the world has changed dramatically. You can't say boo to a goose now, can you?" Carl had made a rare return appearance on ITV a little earlier when he was interviewed by Kate Garraway for the Life Stories show, during which he noted, "It makes you realise how something can go instantly and how you can be the king of the castle one day and the next day you're not allowed on the castle grounds." But you're not likely to see Carl very often on the castle grounds of ITV these days, although you might be one of the handful of people to catch him online now that he's resumed presenting the Drive Time show on the rebranded streaming-only platform Talk. The most current news we have from September 2025 is that Jezza and his fellow Talk presenter, the grouchy journalist Mike Graham, are planning a spectacular one-night-only live event for November 2025 to be held at O2's Shepherd's Bush Empire under the name of World of Common Sense. Well, we say spectacular event. It sounds as if it will largely consist of Jezza and Mike Graham talking to the stage and complaining about the madness of the world today. But we're promised an evening of startling revelations, crazy stories, and laughs galore. So, book early to ensure disappointment. The death of Steve Dymond may have had far more reaching consequences than needed the cancellation of a shouty morning television show, though. In the wake of Steve's death, Ofcom released fresh guidelines in 2021 which put more responsibility on broadcasters for the well-being of participants before, during, and after their appearance on a TV show. Broadcasters must now take due care of the welfare and dignity of participants, particularly those who might be at risk of significant harm as a result of taking part. Greater vigilance must also be taken in assessing potential risks to participants, screening participants who may be considered vulnerable, and providing adequate counselling and medical support. This certainly sounds like a step in the right direction, although critics such as Dr. Charlotte Armitage, a specialist psychologist in film and TV, still feel that there's a hell of a long way to go in offering the right levels of support across the industry. There's still a feeling in some quarters that participants should be legally required to have comprehensive psychological evaluations before taking part in a reality television show, and there's a suspicion that broadcasters will be reluctant to accept this, as it could potentially mean the rejection of some of the livelier and more unpredictable participants who have the potential to make a show come alive. There are others who feel that if we venture too far down this path, we're going to end up with a ridiculously over-restrictive set of rules in which potential contestants need to undergo full psychological evaluations before doing anything as risky as taking part in an episode of blankety blank. The debate may continue for some time into the future, but it still seems very unlikely that we'll ever see anything like the Jeremy Kyle show again. And it does seem peculiar watching back old clips today and considering how this was ever considered perfectly acceptable, especially when we think about just how recently this show was broadcast every weekday. Carl refers to a bygone era, which makes it sound like we're talking about a toe-kerningly outdated show from the 1970s, which reflects the language and attitudes of the time. But we're talking about a show that was still in production just 6 years ago, and that feels a bit bonkers. There are many who feel that the Jeremy Kyle show was never properly held to account for willfully misleading the viewers and dishing up dubious entertainment for 14 years with a format in which real lives could potentially be wrecked by unreliable results. There's some truth in this, as the Parliamentary inquiry into reality television just quietly fizzled away, whilst the inquest into the death of Steve Dymond was never intended to put the show itself on trial. There always seemed something inherently distasteful about a wholly unqualified host attempting to resolve the conflicts of working class people by winding many of them up into a state of aggression so that the viewers could sit back and enjoy the fallout. That's not to say that the show didn't change many lives for the better, though, particularly when it came to helping people who were grappling with drug addiction. Carl's own knowledge in this area seemed woefully ignorant, as he appeared to be one of the opinion that anybody who occasionally smoked cannabis was in exactly the same boat as somebody with a full-blown heroin addiction, and treated them accordingly. But we're sure that the Aftercare team, led by the show's resident psychotherapist, Graham Stanier, had a bit more of an inkling on how to handle these situations and where to guide the guests seeking rehabilitation. Graham himself has often come under fire for his participation in such a hostile show in which Carl would frequently be yelling into the faces of vulnerable people, and it was noted that the psychotherapist has never faced anywhere near as much scrutiny as the host. Graham has always been fiercely defensive of the show and the aftercare processes, pointing out that the show had a hugely positive impact on the lives of the type of people who may otherwise have been unheard or ignored. When he was briefly questioned at the 2019 Parliamentary inquiry about Carl's confrontational manner, Graham replied, "That is the presenter's style. I am responsible for me and my behaviour. I can't be responsible for the presenter's behaviour." The show also had a pretty impressive track record with paternity tests and providing definitive answers for people who've been left in the dark for far too long. Not too surprising, as the DNA tests were over 99.9% accurate, so they were unlikely to make any life-changing cock-ups in this department. But you can't say the same about the polygraph tests, and this remains the most controversial aspect of the show. Despite the tones of complete exoneration from the inquest, there are still critics left pondering if a failure of a polygraph test presented in a misleading way could have played a pivotal role in the death of Steve Dymond. But will we ever know for sure? It's worth emphasising that Steve Dymond didn't take his own life because he failed a polygraph test. He took his own life because he was devastated by the breakup of his relationship. A man like Steve Dymond, with a history of depression, overdose attempts, and a very recent referral to an acute mental health care team, shouldn't have gone anywhere near the Jeremy Kyle show. In an ideal world, Steve and Jane would have found a different way to get to the problem of their relationship issues. But they've both been convinced by the misleading nature of the show that taking a lie detector test would provide concrete answers and resolve the turmoil once and for all. It would seem unfair to blame the show's own aftercare team for allowing Steve to participate. They only had a vague letter from a GP to work with, and the registered mental health nurse Steph McDonald conducted her own mental health assessment of the potential guest. We know that the show's policy was to reject guests suffering from depression. It may have been useful if the GP had gone into a bit more detail in his letter and perhaps mentioned that Steve had been referred to an acute mental health team just 2 months earlier and was not officially considered to be over his depression. But in the meantime, Steve was putting on a show and being upbeat and cheerful and denying any history of attempting to take his own life on mental health referrals. In other words, it was Steve's continuing lies that had secured him a spot on the show he should have never really been on. The manner in which he was treated on the show now seems unduly harsh, as it's very possible that Steve was telling the truth about not cheating, yet was being heckled by the audience and slagged off by the host for being a liar. But that was the familiar toxic formula of this long-running show, produced in a seemingly chaotic environment in which young researchers were under immense pressure to keep coming up with stories and fill up the slots, so the lack of accountability for any of the show's failings was, unsurprisingly, a bit staggering, as everyone just seemed to be pointing the finger at each other. Graham Stanier said that he wasn't responsible for the host's behaviour. Nobody really knew a damn thing about the lie detectors, so they couldn't answer a question on that. And the man who'd spent 14 years demanding that his guests grow a pair chickened out on appearing before a parliamentary inquiry. Apparently it wasn't his show at all. It just had his name on it, and he found it super annoying that his television career had been killed off as a result. It's as if no actual individual wanted to take responsibility for anything, but instead the blame was pinned on the show, as if it was a self-sustaining, governing force. And all the while, ITV were just waffling on about how committed they are to improving their industry-leading standards without ever conceding that the show was lying about lie detectors. Jane Callahan now believes that the show bears some responsibility for what happened to Steve. Again though, she's talking about the show as a whole rather than specific individuals. She told the Daily Mail in 2022, as far as I'm concerned, it did contribute towards his death, because I found out in the documentary that the lie detector was actually 50 to 60%, and not a chance in hell would me and Steve have gone onto that show if I knew that. Now I believe that Steve was telling the truth. Ultimately though, a number of complex and distressing factors were at work here, and it would be too simplistic to pile all the blame on a terrible TV show, regardless of its many faults and the subsequent shameless ducking of any real accountability. A man with a history of depression, overdose attempts, and habitual lying took his own life after lying to get onto a TV show. It's possible that the tragic end to Steve Dymond's life may not have been so very different without any input from the Jeremy Kyle Show. The end of the Jeremy Kyle Show may have been equally inevitable without the participation of Steve Dymond, as it did often seem like a tragic incident waiting to explode at any time. The only remaining question is how on earth such a cruel, deceptive, and potentially dangerous format was allowed to run for so long, and much of the blame for the show's longevity must surely lie with ourselves. 1 million people tuned in every day whilst enjoying their coffee and Weetabix. As Carl himself later admitted, much of the show's popularity boiled down to viewers feeling better about their own lives whilst observing the miserable misfortunes of others. The show was a ratings hit in the daytime schedule, and that's why over 3,000 episodes of it were produced. There were millions more people who didn't regularly watch the show, of course, but we very rarely heard anyone raising their voices to demand the immediate cancellation of a monstrous format. It took the death of a participant for everyone to suddenly start bristling with outrage over why such a show existed. Thankfully, there's been a significant shift in the tone of daytime telly over the last few years, and we're never going to see anything quite like the Jeremy Kyle Show ever again, unless Homes Under the Hammer takes a surprisingly dark new twist. The career and reputation of Jeremy Kyle will never fully recover, and we hope that he's not expecting an invitation back to the castle grounds anytime soon. But don't forget about his upcoming live event with Mike Graham at O2 Shepherd's Bush Empire, which Jezza promises will be hysterical. Really? This test says you're a liar, pal. Get off your stage.